Marin Delaney was kneeling on the cold wooden floor of a back room in a South Brooklyn nightclub. Her flour-calloused hands clenched together when the phone in her apron pocket buzzed. She looked up. A name lit up the screen. A name she whispered every morning when she unlocked her bakery. The name of the man who was supposed to slip a wedding ring onto her finger the following week. Brent. But the call wasn't meant for her. It was glowing on a different phone, one resting in the hand of the man standing in front of her. A tall man in a tailored black suit, a scar cutting through his left brow, eyes as cold as winter water. Rhodey Blackwood. All of South Brooklyn knew his name, and nobody dared say it too loudly. He was scrolling through Brent's phone, the one his people had just confiscated, and then he stopped at a single message. He read it again. Then he lifted his gaze to her, the woman trembling on the floor, the woman everyone had only ever seen the size of, and never once the heart of. "Do you know what the man you're about to marry is using you for?" he asked, his voice low and slow. Marin couldn't answer. Her throat had closed. He turned the screen toward her, showing a text where Brent boasted about how perfectly his clueless bakery scheme was running. And in the moment, she finished reading those cold, calculating words, proving that the man she loved was merely using her as a shield for his crimes. Marin felt something inside her chest crack open, quiet and final, like the hard glaze on a cake split clean in two by a knife. That was the night Marin Delaney's whole world dropped out from under her, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. If you've ever been underestimated, ever been looked at without ever truly being seen, stay with this story to the end. Hit like to keep us going. Share this video so someone who needs it today can hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart like this one. Rhodey Blackwood didn't say another word about the message. He only looked at her for a long while longer, with the gaze of a man used to reading people the way he read contracts, then gave a slight nod to the man standing at the door. "Take her home," he said, his voice still low and slow as before, without the slightest rush, "and make sure she gets there safely." Marin thought she must have heard wrong. From the moment she was brought into this room, she had prepared herself for the worst, had imagined every possible ending that could befall an unknown woman who had wandered into the world of men like him. And yet the most powerful man in South Brooklyn was telling his man to take her home safely, as though she were some harmless object brought here by mistake. She was helped to her feet, her legs numb and almost without feeling, and as she stepped across the threshold, she heard Rhodey's voice drift after her from behind, not speaking to her but to himself, so softly she wasn't sure she had heard it right. Poor thing. She really doesn't know anything. The driver took her away in absolute silence. Marin sat in the back seat, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap, and she realized she was still wearing the flour-stained apron, the apron with her name and Brent's embroidered in the corner, the gift he had given her on their anniversary. She tried to remember how this evening had begun, tried to put the sequence of events back in order in her mind, the way she always arranged ingredients before beginning a difficult batch of pastry. Brent had called her near evening, his voice cheerful and gentle as usual. "I have one small thing I need your help with, sweetheart," he had said. "There's an envelope I need delivered to a business friend at the club on 18th Street. But I'm stuck in a meeting I can't get out of. Could you bring it for me? Just hand it directly to him and that's it. Nothing complicated." And she had agreed. Of course she had agreed, because she always agreed with him. Because after more than 30 years of a life in which hardly anyone had needed her, the feeling of being asked for help by a man like Brent made her feel important. She had closed the shop half an hour early, taken the thick envelope he had left waiting on the cash register counter, and called a taxi to the address he had given her. She hadn't even opened it. She had never been curious about Brent's work, partly because she trusted him, partly because she was afraid that if she asked too many questions, she would become a burden, and burdens were always left behind. But now, sitting inside the expensive car rolling through the rain, wet streets of Brooklyn, she began to wonder what had been inside that envelope, and why delivering one simple envelope had turned into a night in which she was held inside a dark room with Rhodey Blackwood, why Brent's phone had ended up in the hands of Rhodey's men, and above all, what the line she had just read really meant. The car stopped in front of her bakery on Bay Ridge Street, the small sign reading Marin's Corner swaying faintly beneath the yellow light. The driver got out and opened the door for her, strangely polite, then waited until she fitted the key into the lock and stepped safely inside before driving away. Marin closed the door behind her and stood still in the familiar darkness of the shop. This place smelled like her whole life: flour, vanilla, caramelized sugar still lingering from the afternoon batch, the only scent in the world that had ever made her feel peaceful. She found her way behind the counter, sat down on the old wooden chair, and in that pitch-dark room, let the silence cover her. She didn't cry. She only sat there, both hands resting on her knees, and thought. People had always said she was a slow girl, a clumsy girl, a girl the world glanced over once and then turned away from. But no one knew that behind those gentle eyes was a mind always observing, always remembering, always arranging. And now, in the dark, she was arranging every broken piece of tonight. An envelope she wasn't supposed to open, a club that belonged to Rhodey Blackwood, a message that had split her heart in two. And one question kept ringing through her mind, like the oven bell announcing that the bread was done. That terrifying man could have done anything to her tonight. So why had he let her go? To understand why a woman like Maren could trust a man like Brent so completely that she would close her eyes and carry an envelope for him without knowing what was inside, one had to go back 14 months, to the autumn morning she still remembered as clearly as if it had been carved into her. Back then, her bakery was slowly dying. Maren's corner was only a tiny shop wedged between a laundromat and a shoe repair store, with a faded sign and a glass display case that was always still full of pastries by the end of the day. She had poured into it everything she had, every dollar she had saved, every sleepless night, every baking recipe her mother had left behind in a yellowed notebook, and still it wasn't enough to live on. Maren had grown up never knowing what it felt like to be truly needed by anyone. Her mother died when she was too young to hold on to a full memory, and in the years that followed, she grew up in a home where people raised her out of duty rather than love, where she learned that if she wanted to stay, she had to be useful, had to be good, had to not bother anyone. She carried that bitter lesson into adulthood like a scar that never healed, and it made her the kind of person who always tried to please everyone, who was always afraid of becoming a burden, who was pitifully grateful every time someone showed her even a little kindness. The world looked at her and saw only a large, quiet woman standing behind a bakery counter with an awkward smile, and most people looked at her with a mixture of pity and faint contempt, the kind of look she had grown so used to that it almost no longer hurt. Then, on that fateful morning, the shop door opened, and Brent Holloway walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, carrying with him an air of confidence that her usual customers never had. He looked around at the glass case filled with unsold pastries, then turned to her and smiled, a broad, warm smile that made her lower her face in embarrassment. "Give me all of it," he said. Maren stared, thinking she must have misheard, and he laughed more brightly, telling her to box up every pastry in the case for him, saying he would take them back to the office and treat his coworkers. While she clumsily arranged the pastries into boxes, he leaned against the counter, watched her quick hands, and said a sentence she would remember forever afterward. "You've got golden hands," he said, his voice full of admiration. "If pastries this good are sitting here unsold, it can only be because people don't know about you yet." How long had it been since anyone had said something like that to her? How long since any man had looked at her not with pity, but with something almost like appreciation? Her heart began to flutter foolishly, and she scolded herself at once, telling herself not to be stupid, because why would a man like him ever notice a woman like her? But Brent came back the next day, then the day after that. He began stopping by the shop every morning, sitting at the table near the window, drinking coffee and talking to her about all kinds of things, and for the first time in Maren's life, she felt interesting, felt worth listening to, felt like a human being instead of a shadow standing behind a counter. He praised her mother's recipes, asked about the dreams she had never told anyone, looked into her eyes when she spoke as though every word she said mattered, and she, the woman who had spent her whole life longing to be seen, slipped into that love as quickly as sugar dissolving in hot water. 6 months later, one afternoon just after the shop had closed, Brent knelt down right in the middle of the bakery, scented with butter and vanilla, opened a small velvet box, and asked if she would agree to become his wife. Maren burst into tears, her trembling hands rising to cover her mouth, and she said yes before he had even finished the question. She had no idea that the most beautiful moment of her life was, in truth, only a coldly calculated move, that the man kneeling before her had never once seen her the way she believed he had. After the engagement, everything in Maren's life seemed to brighten, and she believed it was the reward for all the quiet years she had endured, without realizing that signs were silently stacking up, layer by layer, thin and light enough that no one noticed, just like the way flour is sifted over a table. one layer covering another until the whole surface turns white, and we still think it was always clean that way. The first layer came one morning when Maren opened the mail and discovered that the bank debt on the bakery, the debt that had weighed on her chest for years, had suddenly been paid off completely. She called Brent in tears, both overjoyed and bewildered, and he only laughed lightly over the phone, saying it was an early wedding gift for her, that from now on she didn't need to worry about money anymore. When she pressed him about where he had gotten such a large sum, he gently brushed it aside, telling her not to trouble herself over money. That was men's business, and she let the question drift away because she didn't want to ruin something beautiful with her own suspicion. The second layer was a little thicker. Brent suggested renovating the small storeroom behind the shop, saying she needed a proper place to store ingredients, and after the work was done, he installed a brand new heavy lock on the storeroom door, then kept the key for himself. Whenever Maren needed flour or sugar, she had to ask him to open it, and he always had a reasonable explanation: fear of thieves, valuable supplies, wanting to spare her the trouble. She found it a little strange that it was her shop's storeroom, and yet she had no key. But then she told herself he only wanted to take care of her, and a lucky woman shouldn't nitpick the man who was caring for her. The third layer was delicate, but cold. A few times a week, after closing, Brent brought strange men into the shop. Men dressed politely, but with eyes that made Maren uneasy, and each time he would affectionately tell her to go upstairs to the small loft above the bakery and rest first, saying it was only dull business talk and she didn't need to hear it. She heard their muffled discussions downstairs, heard the storeroom door open and close, but every time she meant to go down and ask, she stopped, because she was afraid that if she seemed too troublesome, if she asked too many questions, this fragile happiness would disappear. Then came the fourth layer, when strange orders began to arrive, customers she had never met, ordering absurdly large quantities of pastries, hundreds of pieces for parties whose guests she never saw, and all of them paid in cash. Thick stacks of bills that Brent was always the one to collect and put away. It was during those days that June Tabor began to speak up. June was Maren's only friend, and also her only employee. A quick, petite young woman who had been with the bakery since its hardest days, and one of the rare people who loved Maren for exactly who she was. One evening, while the two of them were wiping down the counter, June stopped, looked at her friend with worried eyes, and said softly, "Don't you think everything has been strange lately? Where is all this money coming from? Who are these strange customers? I don't feel right about him, Maren." But Maren only gave a sad smile, placed her hand over her friend's, and said, "Don't worry about me. For the first time in my life, someone truly loves me. For the first time, someone looks at me and sees that I'm worth something, and I don't want to lose that because of baseless doubts." June fell silent, but her eyes still carried an unspoken unease, because she could see what Maren, in her desperate longing to be loved, was deliberately refusing to let herself see, that those fragile layers of flour were piling up on top of one another, until one day they would be thick enough to bury everything. What Maren didn't know, what she would only piece together much later from scattered fragments, was that the envelope she had obediently carried to the club that night didn't contain ordinary business papers the way Brent had claimed. Inside it was a stack of forged contracts and debt papers, and on them was a signature, copied with a precision so careful it mimicked every stroke, the signature of Rhodey Blackwood. For months, Brent had quietly turned Maren's little bakery into a money laundering machine. And he hadn't done it under his own name, but under Rhodey's shadow. The strange customers ordering hundreds of pastries and paying in cash, the murmured meetings after closing, the locked storeroom for which only he had the key, all of it was part of a chain Brent had built to turn dirty money into clean income through an honest bakery. And to reassure the partners in the dark enough for them to put their money in, he had recklessly impersonated the most powerful boss in South Brooklyn, implying that the entire operation stood under Rhodey's protection. It was the gamble of a greedy and arrogant man. Brent was the kind of person who believed he was smarter than everyone else, that he could borrow that frightening name for profit and never be discovered. Because in his eyes, a man like Rhodey was busy with larger matters and would never bother noticing a tiny bakery in Bay Ridge and a gentle, heavy-set owner. He had underestimated Rhodey in exactly the same way he had underestimated Maren, and that was his fatal mistake, because nothing slipped past that man's network of eyes and ears. When the forged papers began to circulate, Rhodey's people traced the trail within only a few days, and they had been waiting at the club that night, not to catch Brent, who was cunning enough never to appear himself, but to intercept the person he had sent to make the delivery. They hadn't expected that person to be a woman in a flour-stained apron, trembling and bewildered, clutching an envelope she didn't even know the contents of. And that was why, after everything, Rhodey Blackwood had let her go. He was a man who had spent his whole life reading people, separating liars from the innocent through a glance, a gesture, a breath. When he looked at that woman, he didn't see the craftiness of an accomplice, didn't see the calculation of a link in the chain. He saw hands calloused from flour, the hands of an honest worker, not of someone trading in dirty money. He saw real fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that couldn't be faked, and he also saw the absolute confusion of someone who didn't understand what was happening around her. In his life, he had met every kind of person, and he knew exactly what a pawn looked like, someone used down to the last breath while still believing they were being loved. This woman was exactly such a pawn, and Rhodey, the man all of South Brooklyn feared, had one rule he had never broken: never punish the innocent, never spill the blood of the weak in place of the truly guilty. So he ordered that she be taken home safely. But he kept Brent's phone, the one his men had recovered, because inside that phone was everything he needed to expose the man who had dared borrow his name, and also because, though even he couldn't explain it at the time, there was something about that quiet woman that made it impossible for him to simply turn his back and leave her to her fate. Another woman might have collapsed after that night, might have hidden beneath the blankets and cried until there were no tears left. But Marin wasn't that kind of person, because all her life she had learned that tears couldn't knead a batch of dough, and that when faced with a difficult recipe, the only things that could save you were calmness, precision, and hands that didn't shake. She told herself she would handle this exactly the way she handled the hardest batch of pastry in her life, one step at a time, measuring carefully, not panicking, not missing anything. The next morning, she still opened the bakery as usual, still baked, still smiled at customers, and June, the only person who noticed that something had changed in her friend's eyes, only watched quietly and didn't yet dare ask. But that night, when the shop door had been locked and the city had sunk into sleep, Marin sat down before the old computer behind the cash register, the computer that held all the records of Marin's corner, and for the first time in her life, she opened it not to calculate the cost of flour and sugar, but to search for the truth. The bakery was in her name. Every account carried her name. She had always had the right to look at those numbers. She had simply never thought she needed to doubt her own life. On the first night, she only sat and read, scanning through every transaction from nearly the past year. And the more she read, the colder the feeling inside her became. The numbers didn't match. Reported revenue was many times higher than the amount of pastries her shop could actually produce. Enormous orders were recorded on days she clearly remembered the bakery being empty. Large amounts of cash flowed in and then flowed out through company names she had never heard before. On the second night, she began taking notes, as carefully as if she were writing down a recipe. She made a list of the strangest customer names, the entities that had ordered hundreds of pastries and paid in cash for months. And then she did the thing Brent would never have expected a woman he looked down on to think of. She began tracing each of those names. She looked them up, called the phone numbers listed in the records, and every time it was the same. Either the number didn't exist, or the voice on the other end was a lifeless, automated system for a virtual office, or the registered address was only an empty mailbox in a building no one occupied. The generous customers who had kept her bakery alive for almost a year. It turned out, none of them were real. They were only names on paper, hollow shells built to conceal something far darker. On the third night, when she fitted it all together, the truth appeared so clearly and coldly that she had to place a hand over her chest to make sure her heart was still beating. For 11 months, ever since around the time Brent had paid off the bakery's debt, the little shop she had poured her whole soul into, the shop that bore her name and stood on her mother's recipes, had been turned into a machine for cleaning dirty money. The happiness she had believed was her reward in life was actually only a screen for the crimes of the man she loved. Marin sat silently before the cold glow of the screen inside the dark bakery, and she didn't cry. She only felt something in her mind turn cold and sharp, the feeling of someone who had just understood that she had been deceived in a systematic, calculated way from the very first day. She quietly copied all of that data onto a tiny flash drive, then stood, went into the kitchen, opened an untouched box of flour, buried the flash drive at the bottom of the fine white powder, closed the lid, and placed it back in its exact spot on the shelf. hidden among dozens of identical flower boxes. If Brent underestimated her enough to believe she would never see through him, then she would let him keep believing that until the right moment. Maren had thought the shock of the numbers was the very bottom of the truth, that she had already touched the deepest floor of pain. But she was wrong, because some wounds don't live in the mind, they live in the heart. And that wound arrived on a rainy afternoon, 3 days after the night she buried the flash drive at the bottom of the flower box. The shop door flew open so hard that the wind chimes above it clattered wildly, and a young woman stepped in, soaked from the rain, her face flushed with anger. She was beautiful in the way the world always praises, slender, sharp, with eyes bright with hostility, and she swept one look around the bakery before stopping on Maren, then asked in an icy voice whether she was Maren, the woman Brent was about to marry. Maren hadn't even had time to understand what was happening before the woman launched into a stream of bitter words, introducing herself as Whitney Price, Brent's girlfriend, the real woman in his life, and saying she had come here today to see with her own eyes the person who had stepped between them. June, standing behind the counter, immediately moved forward as if to protect her friend, but Maren gently lifted a hand to stop her. While Whitney was still pouring out accusations, there was something in her voice, a real hurt hidden beneath the anger, that made Maren feel not hatred, but a chilling suspicion rising inside her. Instead of arguing back, she only calmly asked Whitney one question: how long she had known Brent. Whitney stopped short, then answered that it had been more than 2 years. 2 years. Maren calculated in her head, and that number stabbed her more sharply than any insult could have, because she and Brent had only known each other for 14 months. This woman had been in his life before he ever walked into her bakery. Maren quietly pulled out a chair, invited Whitney to sit, and said in a voice so calm that it surprised Whitney that perhaps both of us need to talk. The two women sat across from each other by the pastry counter, and they did the very thing rivals in love were never supposed to do. They placed their phones on the table and began comparing. They matched every message, every date, every promise, and the truth slowly emerged like a burned batch of pastry revealed when the oven door opened. Brent had loved Whitney, or at least had made her believe that he did, long before he met Maren. He had drained the inheritance Whitney's father had left her, little by little, under the name of profitable investments he had painted for her, projects that never came into being. Whitney, just like Maren, had never known about the dirty money operation, had never known what the bakery was being used for. She was only another woman stripped down to her last dollar by the sweet words of a liar. And the more they pieced together, the more both women understood the bitterest truth, that Maren had never been Whitney's rival, that she wasn't the woman Brent loved and then betrayed Whitney for. She was only a tool, an honest bakery registered under the name of a gentle woman no one would suspect. That was the perfect screen Brent needed to launder dirty money. And the engagement, the loving words, the ring, all of it was only the cheap price he had to pay to keep that screen obedient and blind. Whitney broke down first, covering her face with both hands, stammering about how foolish she had been. And then something strange happened. Maren, the woman who had just discovered that both her love and her life had been a performance, was the one who reached out and took the other woman's hand. June quietly poured each of them a cup of hot tea, placed them on the counter, then stood behind Maren, one hand resting on her friend's shoulder like a comfort that needed no words. Inside, the bakery scented with vanilla, the three women sat together in silence, and for the first time, Maren realized that she wasn't alone in this pain. After Whitney left, after June had finished cleaning up, and only after worrying and reminding Maren again and again, finally locked the door and went home, Maren sat alone in the empty bakery, and she knew there was still one thing she hadn't dared face. While the two women had been comparing their phones that afternoon, Whitney had accidentally scrolled past a string of messages Brent had sent her. Messages Whitney had quickly tried to hide, her eyes lowered with awkward pity, and Maren had still managed to see her own name appear there. She had pretended not to notice, but that name, her name, sitting in the middle of the words Brent had written to another woman, haunted her for the rest of the evening. Now, alone in the shop, she took out the piece of paper Whitney herself had hesitantly given her before leaving, saying that Maren had the right to know, even though she wished Maren didn't have to read it. It was a few lines Whitney had copied from her phone. Maren sat down on the chair behind the counter, opened the paper beneath the yellow light, and began to read. She had prepared herself for betrayal, for false words of love, for the truth that she had only been a pawn. But she hadn't prepared herself for this, because what Brent wrote about her wasn't the language of a cold-hearted seducer. It was the language of a man full of contempt. He wrote about her as though she were a joke. He mocked her body with Whitney, turned her into something for the two of them to amuse themselves with, called her names she couldn't bear to read a second time, and described having to play the part of her lover as a disgusting sacrifice he was forced to endure for money. He wrote that he had to close his eyes whenever he was with her, that she was so foolish and so easy to lead around, that a few compliments were enough to make her believe anything, that a woman like her would never dare dream anyone would ever look her way. So of course she clung to him. Line by line, it was no longer merely deceit, but the most naked kind of mockery of who she was, of the body she had carried all her life like a curse. Maren set the paper down. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't scream, didn't break anything, didn't sob aloud. She only stood quietly, walked into the kitchen at the back, the kitchen that was her whole world, the only place on earth that had ever made her feel she had value, and slowly sat down on the cold tile floor, her back against the flower cabinet, her knees drawn up into her arms. Around her were the scents of sugar, flour, and vanilla, the fragrances that had soothed her through so many lonely nights. And yet tonight even they couldn't comfort her. She sat there on the kitchen floor, small in the dark room, and she didn't cry out loud, because she had learned very early in life that no one cared enough to listen to the sound of her crying. What broke her wasn't that he had another woman, and it wasn't even that he had used her bakery for dark things. She could survive betrayal. She had been used to being left behind since childhood. What cut into the marrow of her bones was realizing that for 14 whole months, the man she had loved with all her heart, the man she had cared for, trusted, and given even her mother's recipes to, had never seen her as a human being for even a single moment. In his eyes, she had never been his future wife. Never been a woman worthy of love. She had only been a joke, something pathetic, a convenient and laughable tool. All her life, she had feared this more than anything. Feared that behind people's smiles, they had always seen her as pitiful and ridiculous, and now she had clear proof in black and white that the fear had been real. Maren sat on that cold kitchen floor for a very long time, holding herself in the dark, a woman the whole world had never bothered to truly look at. 3 days after the night on the kitchen floor, while Maren was wiping down the last baking trays before closing time, a glossy black car stopped in front of the shop, and the driver who had taken her home that night stepped inside, politely tipped his hat, and said that Mr. Blackwood wished to speak with her, if she agreed. Maren had thought she would be afraid, but strangely, after everything she had just been through, that fear no longer came. She nodded, took off her apron, and left June to watch the shop, telling her that if she wasn't back in more than an hour, she should call someone. This time, she wasn't taken to any dark room, but to a quiet restaurant that had been closed to regular guests, where Rhodey Blackwood sat alone at the only table still lit. He stood when she entered, a courtesy she hadn't expected, then invited her to sit. He went straight to the point, without circling around it, saying that he knew she had nothing to do with what Brent had done, that his people had investigated thoroughly, and she was entirely clean, but there was one thing he needed, and that was evidence. He said Brent had impersonated him, had forged his signature on papers that could destroy relationships he had spent years building, and that if she had anything that could prove it, he would be grateful. Maren looked at the powerful man sitting across from her, and instead of answering right away, she asked him a question: why he had let her go that night, when he had more than enough power to do the opposite. Rhodey was silent for a long while, and his cold eyes seemed to soften a little. Then he said that in his life, he had seen too many liars, so he knew very well what an honest person looked like, and that her hands had told him everything he needed to know about who she was. He said he respected the way she had stood up instead of collapsing, the way she had faced the truth instead of running from it, because to him, courage wasn't measured by how strong a person appeared to be, but by whether they could still lift their head even after being crushed. Then he told her something that very few people in South Brooklyn had probably ever heard. He told her about his younger sister, the sister he loved more than his own life. She had grown up as a gentle and sensitive girl, but because her appearance was different, people had mocked her from childhood. Friends had rejected her, and cruel words had worn her down piece by piece until she had almost lost herself. There had been dark years when his whole family had thought they might lose her forever to despair. Years when she had needed the care of doctors, the patience of those who loved her, and the strength from within herself to slowly find her way back to life. Now she was healthy, peaceful, and had learned how to love the person she was, but Rhodey said he never forgot the nights he had sat beside his sister's bed, helpless before the pain that other people's cruel words had caused. That was why, he said, his voice lowering and hardening like steel. Of all the kinds of people in this world, the kind he despised most, the kind he would never tolerate, was the kind who used another person's vulnerability as entertainment, the kind who trampled on a human being's dignity simply because they looked different. Maren listened to him speak, and she understood that he knew about those messages, that he had read the mockery Brent had written about her, and that to this man, it wasn't only a crime against her, but something that had touched the deepest wound in his own life. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time since that fateful night, she felt she wasn't facing someone frightening, but an ally. "I have what you need," she said softly, "and I think it's time both of us made him pay." But a man like Brent was never completely unaware of the changes around him, and only a few days after Maren's meeting with Rhodey, he appeared at the bakery late one evening, using the excuse that he needed to get a few things from the locked storeroom. Maren was sitting behind the counter, and though she had managed to turn off the computer screen, the instant she heard his key rattling in the door, something in the way she was sitting, in the way she looked at him, had changed, and Brent, who was always alert, sensed it at once. He stopped in the middle of the shop, narrowed his eyes, then asked in that familiar, falsely sweet voice whether something had been wrong with her lately, sweetheart, since she had been so quiet. Maren answered that she was only tired, but he didn't believe her. He stepped closer to the counter, his eyes flicking toward the computer, then sweeping over the whole shop like an animal that had caught the scent of danger, and his voice suddenly changed, turning cold, losing every trace of the tenderness he had been pretending to feel. He asked her directly whether she had touched the bakery's books, what she had seen, what she had copied. Maren understood that denying it now would only make everything worse, so she did the thing she had prepared in her mind for days. She pretended to be frightened, and finally lowered her head, confessing that she had been curious and looked through a little, had copied some of it onto a flash drive because she didn't understand the numbers, and had planned to ask someone to look at them for her. Brent's eyes darkened. He held out his hand, ordering her to give it to him immediately, and by then his voice no longer carried even a trace of the man who had once knelt down and asked her to marry him. It was the voice of a man backed into a corner, ready to do anything to protect himself. He threatened her, saying she had no idea what she was getting herself tangled in, that the people behind him weren't as gentle as she imagined, that if she were smart, she would keep her mouth shut and forget everything if she still wanted peace. Maren stood, her hands truly trembling, but not because she was weak, because she was playing her part to the end. She walked into the kitchen, opened her recipe drawer, and pulled out an old flash drive she used for saving digital baking charts, praying he wouldn't look too deeply. She placed it in Brent's outstretched palm. He snatched it, hurriedly plugged it into his phone to check, and when he saw nothing but lines about flour, sugar, oven temperature, and rising time, his face relaxed with relief. He gave a contemptuous laugh, threw out a mocking sentence that, of course, her head was only capable of holding pastry things like this, then put the flash drive into his pocket, took what he needed from the storeroom, and left, completely certain that his foolish woman still knew nothing at all. He had no idea that the real flash drive, the one containing the whole truth about his 11 months of crime, was still lying quietly at the bottom of a flower box among dozens of identical boxes on the shelf. That night, when Maren told Rhodey everything over the phone, his voice turned low and dangerous, and he said he could make Brent disappear from her life that very night, that all she had to do was nod, and Brent would never be able to threaten her again, in the way his world often settled things. Maren was silent for a long while, then refused. She said she understood that he wanted to protect her, and that she was more grateful than he knew, but if she let Brent be handled that way, then she too would become something she hated, and she didn't want to rebuild her life on another darkness. She said she wanted him to pay before the law, openly and properly, so the whole world could see who he really was, not vanish in silence as though he had never existed. The other end of the line went quiet for a moment. Then Rhodey said softly, in a voice she had never heard from him before, a voice full of respect, that she was the bravest woman he had ever met, and that he would do it her way. To complete the evidence and arrange everything legally, Rhodey invited Maren to a meeting at an elegant restaurant within his chain of establishments, where he needed her present so a trusted lawyer of his could guide her on how to hand over the evidence through the proper process. Maren hesitated for a long time before going, because places like that had never been her world. Those splendid rooms filled with expensively dressed people always made her feel out of place and watched. She wore the nicest dress she owned, a simple dress she had sewn herself, and stepped inside with all the caution of someone who was used to being judged by the world from the very first glance. Just as she had feared, the moment she sat down at the table with Rhodey and the lawyer, a middle-aged man at the next table, someone well-dressed who seemed to know Rhodey through business circles, looked her up and down with open contempt, then leaned toward the people at his table and said loudly enough for Marin to hear, a mocking remark about how he couldn't understand why a man like Blackwood would be entertaining a woman who looked like that, followed by a cruel comment about her body that made the others around him burst into laughter. Marin felt her face burn, that familiar, painful feeling she had endured all her life, the desire to shrink herself small, to disappear from the room. She lowered her face, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, preparing to swallow that humiliation in silence as she had always done. But this time, something different happened. Rhodey Blackwood set his glass down on the table, slowly and decisively, and the soft sound of crystal touching wood was enough to make the entire area around them go still. He stood up. The most powerful man in South Brooklyn stood upright in the middle of the room, and that alone was enough to kill every laugh and draw every eye toward him. He turned to the man who had just mocked her, and in that low, slow, icy voice everyone in their world knew was a sign of danger, he said that the woman sitting with him was more honest and courageous than every person in that room put together, including himself. He said he had spent his whole life judging people, and he had learned one thing, that a person's worth had never lived in their appearance, but in what they did when no one was watching, in the way they stayed standing when the whole world wanted them to collapse. He looked straight at the man who had laughed at her, and said that anyone who gave himself the right to mock another person because of their looks was the one this entire room ought to despise, and that he wouldn't sit at the same table with that kind of man for even one more second. The entire room sank into absolute silence. The man who had insulted her turned red with embarrassment, stammered a few words of apology, then hurriedly stood and left with his group, under the fearful yet approving gazes of the people who remained. Marin sat there, lifted her head, and felt something break open inside her chest. But this time, it wasn't from pain. In all her life, no one had ever stood up to defend her like that. No man had ever looked at words of contempt aimed at her and chosen to stand beside her instead of staying silent or laughing along. Rhodey sat back down, calm as though nothing had happened, and only softly asked if she was all right, as if what he had just done were the most natural thing in the world. Marin looked at him, and in that moment, she realized that this frightening man didn't see in her a body to be judged, but a human being to be respected, and something very small, very warm, began to take root in her hardened heart. With the real flash drive taken from the bottom of the flower box, and with the careful guidance of the lawyer Rhodey trusted, Marin began to proceed with everything in an orderly and lawful way, exactly like the person she was, careful and precise as when she weighed each ingredient for a batch of pastry. She went to the authorities as a cooperating victim, an honest shop owner who had been used without knowing it, and the entire trove of data she had gathered over those 3 sleepless nights became the key that threw open an entire criminal network. The lawyer skillfully arranged things so that the evidence pointed straight to one person, Brent Holloway, and to the very mechanism he had built, the shell companies, the false transactions, the dirty money flowing through the bakery. More important than anything, among those papers were documents proving clearly that Brent had forged Rhodey Blackwood's signature, that he had borrowed Rhodey's name without permission to deceive his partners, and this both sealed Brent's guilt and washed away every suspicion hanging over Rhodey in an underworld that never forgave betrayal. That was why the alliance between two people who seemed as though they couldn't be more different became so firm. Because when the truth came to light, both Marin and Rhodey took back what Brent had stolen from them. For one it was dignity, for the other it was honor. When the machinery of investigation began to move, everything collapsed around Brent faster than he could ever have imagined. The shell companies he had worked so hard to build were exposed one after another, and when the real identities of the people behind that dirty money began to risk being revealed, his own partners in the dark, the ones he had once believed were his support, immediately turned their backs on him. In that world, nothing was more frightening than someone who had become a liability, and Brent, from a polished broker people had once respected, suddenly became the man everyone wanted to avoid, a man hunted by both the law and the very people who had once stood on his side. He lost nearly everything all at once, Business contracts fell apart. Doors that had once opened wide now slammed shut, and the name Brent Holloway, once spoken with envy, was now spoken only as a warning. And Whitney, the woman who had walked beside him for 2 years, after seeing his true self through everything that had been exposed, quietly gathered what remained of herself and stepped out of his life, without a goodbye, without a trace of regret, carrying with her the most expensive lesson of her life. Brent was now left alone, surrounded by the wreckage he himself had created, a man who had once believed he was smarter than everyone, that he could look down on people and use them without ever having to pay a price. On the day Marin officially completed the handover of all the evidence, when everything had been placed on the right path toward justice, June asked her whether she was afraid of what would come, afraid of him, afraid of all of it. Marin wiped her hands on her apron, looked out through the bakery window where the afternoon sunlight was spreading gold across the street, and answered with a sentence June would remember forever. She said that baking had taught her one thing, that every ingredient had to be weighed exactly right, not a bit too much, not a bit too little, or the whole batch would be ruined. The truth was the same. I'm only putting everything on the scale where it belongs, and letting the truth speak its own weight. And for the first time in so many years, there was no fear left in her voice, only the calm of someone who had done what she believed was right. When a man has lost everything, in the end he returns to the place where he believes there may still be a little mercy left to squeeze dry. And that was why, early one morning, just as Marin had opened the bakery, Brent appeared on the front step of Marin's corner. He was no longer the polished man who had walked into her shop 14 months earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face hollow, his eyes dark from sleeplessness, and there was nothing left in the way he stood of the arrogant confidence he had once carried. He looked at her through the glass door, and when she opened it, he immediately dropped to his knees right there on the step, clasped both hands together, and began to beg. He said he had been wrong, that he was sorry for everything, that he had lost himself, that she was the best person who had ever come into his life, and he had been too stupid to see it. He begged her to help him hide, or to call off Rhodey Blackwood's men, who were hunting him down across the city. He pleaded with her to give him whatever cash was in the register, swearing that she was his only hope left, and that he knew she still had a gentle heart. Tears ran down his face, his voice broke with every word, and for a woman who had spent her whole life longing to be loved, this should have been the moment when her tender heart wavered. But Marin only stood there quietly, looking at the man who had once been her whole world, kneeling at her feet and weeping, and she realized she no longer felt anything. Not love, not hatred, only a strange calm, like water settling after a storm. She let him finish all his pleading, then bent down slightly, just enough to look him straight in the eyes, and she spoke in a voice that didn't tremble, didn't turn cruel, but was simply honest enough to feel cold. She said, "For 1 whole year, you were beside me. You looked at me every day. You held my hand. You promised to marry me, but you never once truly saw me. You only saw a convenient bakery, a foolish woman easy to deceive, a joke you could tell other people about. You looked at me for an entire year and never saw me even once." She straightened again and went on. "Now look carefully, Brent. Look very carefully at the woman you look down on, because this is the last time you'll ever get to see her." He was still kneeling there, stammering her name, trying to hold on, but Marin stepped back, and she said she wouldn't take back anything. She said this wasn't revenge, that she didn't need revenge against him, but simply the price he had to carry for the choices he had made. She said every person had to answer for the seeds they planted, and what was coming for him today hadn't been done to him by anyone else. He had grown it with his own hands over all those months. Then she stepped inside, placed her hand on the door, and before closing it, she said one final sentence, that she forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because she didn't want to carry the weight of hatred for one more day of her life. Then the glass door closed, softly but decisively, separating her from him forever. Brent stayed kneeling on the empty step for a long while longer, then finally staggered to his feet and walked away alone toward the end of the street, a man who had lost everything, carrying the consequences he had chosen for himself. Marin watched his figure disappear through the glass window. Then she turned back to her kitchen, lit the oven, and began a new batch of pastries, her heart lighter than it had ever been. When the storm had passed, and her life slowly returned to a peaceful rhythm, something unexpected came from Rhodey, the man who had now become a warm and familiar presence in her life. During one conversation, When Marin happened to mention that she had struggled with her weight all her life, had tried every kind of diet, exercise, and hunger, yet her body still felt heavy and tired, and that she had grown used to everyone, even the doctors she had seen, assuming it was because she was lazy and lacked willpower. Rhodey quietly remembered it. He had a cousin named Phoebe Ree, a respected endocrinologist, and he gently suggested, not as an order but as a sincere act of care, that Marin try meeting Phoebe once, only to talk and get checked for peace of mind, because he believed that someone as hardworking and disciplined as she was didn't deserve to spend her whole life blaming herself that way. Marin hesitated, because she was far too used to clinics where people merely glanced at her body and drew conclusions before she had even had a chance to speak. But in the end, she agreed. Dr. Phoebe Ree turned out to be a calm woman with eyes that knew how to listen, and from the very first moment, she did something no doctor had ever done for Marin before. She asked, and she truly listened. She asked about Marin's history, about symptoms Marin had always assumed were normal and had never told anyone, about the constant exhaustion, about the changes in her body over the years, about the pressure and stress she had quietly carried throughout her entire life. She ordered a thorough series of tests no one had ever thought to order for her before, and then, a few days later, she asked Marin to come back so they could talk. When Marin sat down in front of her, anxious and uneasy, Dr. Phoebe looked at her with gentle eyes and said that it wasn't her fault. She explained that Marin's body had an endocrine disorder that had been silently present for many years without anyone discovering it. A condition that made her metabolism work differently from other people's, made her body store weight and feel exhausted no matter how hard she had tried. She said this wasn't the whole story, that years of stress, emotional deprivation, and living in fear had also contributed to further upsetting the balance inside her body. But the most important thing, the thing she wanted Marin to remember deep in her bones, was that the condition she carried was not a sign of weakness or laziness. Then she said the sentence Marin would carry with her for the rest of her life. For so many years, people told you that you were lazy, that you were weak, that you didn't know how to try, Dr. Phoebe said softly, but they were all wrong. This is an illness with a real name, and it needs to be treated properly, not judged. You never failed. You simply never had anyone willing to look closely enough to help you. Marin sat there, and this time tears rolled down her face, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of overwhelming relief, because all her life she had believed her body was a punishment, a failure that belonged only to her, something worthy of the world's ridicule and of her own hatred, and now she finally knew that she had never been at fault, that she was only an undiagnosed patient, a human being who had quietly endured while no one had bothered to understand. Dr. Phoebe laid out for her a gentle and steady treatment plan, combining medication, nutrition, and most important of all, rest and peace within her heart, the very thing Marin was allowing herself to have for the first time in her life. And when Marin began that healing journey, she didn't do it to become beautiful in anyone's eyes, didn't do it to be worthy of a man, didn't do it to silence those who had once mocked her, but for the first time in her life, she did it only for herself, because she deserved to live healthily, to feel lighter, to be treated kindly, first and foremost by herself. In the peaceful months that followed, a small, quiet habit began to form, one Marin at first thought was only coincidence, that every Tuesday morning, just as the bakery opened and the scent of fresh pastries was still spreading through the air, Rhodey Blackwood would appear. He didn't come with an entourage, didn't bring with him the frightening aura of power that always surrounded his name. He came alone, in a simple coat, sat down at the small table near the window, ordered a cup of black coffee and one pastry, and paid fairly like any other customer, never accepting special treatment. At first, the two of them exchanged only a few words, but little by little, those Tuesday mornings became something they both quietly looked forward to. Rhodey was a man of few words. He never spoke in flowery promises, never pledged anything grand, but he had one thing Brent had never had: consistency. When he said he would come, he came. When he said he would do something, he did it. He remembered what kind of coffee she liked, remembered how she often stood rubbing her back after long hours beside the oven, even remembered the small things she had never told anyone. And more important than all of that, he looked at her, truly looked at her, looked into her eyes when she spoke, listened to her stories about her mother, about baking recipes, about the dreams she had once buried, as though every word she said had value. He never once mentioned her body, never once made her feel judged, because to him, she had never been only an outward appearance, but always a whole human being. The feelings between them grew slowly and steadily, not the feverish, fleeting feeling she had once mistaken for love, but something firm as the foundation of a house, growing little by little through every Tuesday morning, through every cup of coffee, through every time he was quietly there when she needed him. But life, as always, had a test waiting. When Marin's bakery began to revive and prosper again, when her health improved and people in the neighborhood began speaking her name with respect, a shadow from the past returned. It was the aunt who had raised her, the woman who had taken possession of her mother's bakery after her mother died, the woman who had turned Marin's childhood into a long chain of coldness and cruel words about her appearance. Now she appeared at the bakery door with a falsely sweet smile, opening her arms wide as though nothing had ever happened, calling Marin her dear niece, praising how radiant she looked, praising how successful she had become. She circled around the matter for a while, before finally revealing her real intention, that she was having a little trouble, that after all they were family, that she had always believed Marin would make something of herself, and that perhaps Marin could help her, or give her a share in this now thriving bakery. Marin stood behind the counter, looking at the woman who had once made her believe she was an unwanted child, unworthy of love, and she waited for the familiar pain to rise, but it didn't come. Instead, she felt a steady calm, and she realized she was no longer the little girl who needed this woman's approval. Marin refused gently but firmly. She said she was sorry her aunt was having difficulties, and if it was a temporary matter of food and daily needs, she was willing to help within her means. But she would never share her bakery, because this shop had been built by her own hands, from the very years when that same aunt had looked down on her. Then she said a sentence that left her aunt silent, that there was one thing her aunt needed to know. Her worth had never changed. When she was still a child, her aunt treated as a burden. She had been just as valuable as she was now. When she was heavy and the whole world laughed at her, she had still been just as precious as she was now that she had succeeded. The only difference was that back then, she hadn't known it, and now she did. Her aunt couldn't say another word, only turned away awkwardly and walked out of the bakery. And when the door closed, Marin felt no triumph and no bitterness, only a light, freeing peace, because she had just realized she no longer needed anyone in this world to recognize her worth. She had recognized it herself. 1 year after the night, she knelt on the floor of a dark room inside a club. Marin Delaney's life had changed in a way she had never dared imagine, even in her most beautiful dreams. Marin's corner was now always full of customers. The wind chimes on the door rang almost without stopping, and the scent of fresh pastries spread through the whole street like a warm invitation. But what made her proudest wasn't just the daily profit, but the fact that she had saved enough honest money of her own to completely clear the remaining legacy debts, officially freeing Marin's corner from the ghost of her childhood. She had reclaimed her mother's sanctuary not through luck, but through her own sweat and her own hands, ensuring that the aunt who had once used it to exploit her could never lay a finger on it again. She renovated the entire space into a warm, welcoming haven, and officially dedicated a prominent plaque by the door to her mother's memory, ensuring that the family legacy lived on, whole and dignified. Whitney, the woman who had once stormed into her shop in anger, had now become one of her closest friends. The two women who had once shared the same pain were now building good things together, and Whitney even helped manage the business side of the bakery, finding again the faith in life she had thought she had lost. June was still there, loyal as she had always been, now the trusted manager, the friend who had stood beside Marin from the darkest days to this radiant one. And then, one late afternoon, when golden sunlight stretched through the kitchen window, when the bakery had closed and only the two of them remained, Rhodey Blackwood stepped into the kitchen, scented with vanilla, the place where the soul of Marin's whole life lived. He didn't bring roses. There was no orchestra. There were no flowery words. He only came to her, took a simple ring from his pocket, and in that familiar, low, warm voice, said that from the first moment he saw her, he had seen a person the whole world had missed, and that what he wanted most for the rest of his life was to wake up beside her each morning, to see her, truly see her, every day. He asked if she would agree to become his wife. Marin, the woman who had spent her whole life never believing she deserved to be loved that way, burst into tears and nodded, and he gently slipped the ring onto her finger. After he had gone and the kitchen was once again hers alone in the glow of sunset, Marin slowly sat down on the kitchen tiles, the very same tiles where 1 year earlier she had curled up in the darkness, holding herself and crying without a sound because words of mockery had cut into the deepest part of her heart. But this time was different. This time she sat on that kitchen floor with her face lifted toward the sunlight, her hands wrapped around the hand wearing the ring, and she smiled, a smile rising from the very bottom of her heart, surrounded by the familiar scents of sugar and vanilla that had comforted her through so many lonely nights. She realized something simple that had taken her nearly a lifetime to understand, that she had never been broken or disposable, that her body had never been a punishment, that her heart had never been too much. She had simply lived for a time in a life that didn't belong to her, standing beside people who had never been willing to look at her closely enough. And the lesson her life leaves behind, for her and for all of us, is that a person's worth never lies in outward shape, in weight, or in the judgments of others, but in the heart, in honesty, in the courage to rise after being crushed, and that every one of us deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be loved exactly as we truly are. Never let the world's criticism define your value, and never rush to judge someone only by how they look, because behind every person is an entire story we've never known. If Marin's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can listen together each day to many more meaningful and deeply moving stories. How do you feel about this story, and which part made your heart tremble the most? Please leave a comment and share the sincere feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your inner voice. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. I wish you, the person watching this video, very good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.